30 days. Every time a number repeated on a clock, I wrote it down. Every time a stranger said something that answered a question I'd been sitting with all week, I followed it. Every time a book fell off a shelf, a song lyric hit too close, or a name surfaced 3 times in a single afternoon, I treated it like a signal and I moved toward it. No filtering, no rationalizing it away, no telling myself I was reading too much into things. Just notice, record, follow. Most people who study synchronicity spend their time debating whether it's real, whether the universe is actually speaking, or whether the human brain is just a pattern recognition machine running on overdrive. And that is a genuinely interesting debate, but it wasn't the experiment I wanted to run. I wanted to know what happens to a person, to their decisions, their relationships, their sense of direction when they commit fully to treating these moments as meaningful. Not as proof of anything, not as magic, just as invitations worth accepting. What I found across those 30 days didn't resolve the debate, but it did something more interesting than that. It changed the way I understood what the debate was actually about. And there was one moment about 3 weeks in that I genuinely did not expect. Something that reframed the entire experiment in a single afternoon. We're going to get there, but first, let's establish what we're actually talking about. The word gets thrown around loosely, so let's get precise about it. Carl Jung coined the term in the early 20th century, and from the beginning he was careful, almost frustratingly careful, about what he was and wasn't claiming. Synchronicity for Jung was the experience of 2 or more events that are meaningfully related but not causally connected. The key word there is meaningfully, not randomly, not coincidentally in the shallow sense. Meaningfully, as in, the connection carries a quality of significance that lands in the body before the mind has time to explain it away. His most famous example came from his own clinical practice. A patient was recounting a dream in which she received a golden scarab, a piece of jewelry. As she described the dream, Jung heard a tapping at the window behind him. He opened it. A rose chafer beetle, the closest creature in that part of Europe to an Egyptian scarab, flew into the room. He caught it in his hand and gave it to the patient, saying, "Here is your scarab." That moment broke something loose in her. She had been, in Jung's assessment, psychologically stuck, too locked in a rigid, rational framework to allow any transformation. The impossible coincidence cracked that framework open. Now here is what Jung was not saying. He was not saying the universe physically sent the beetle. He was not making a claim about cosmic intervention. What he was pointing at was something more subtle and, I think, more interesting. That the boundary between inner life and outer event is not as solid as we assume. That sometimes the psyche and the world seem to rhyme. He connected this to his broader concept of the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath individual awareness there is a shared substrate of symbols, archetypes, and patterns that human beings across all cultures draw from without knowing it. Synchronicities, in his framework, were moments when that deeper layer became briefly visible at the surface of ordinary life. The physicist Wolfgang Pauli worked with Jung for decades on this question, which is itself a remarkable fact. Here was one of the founding architects of quantum mechanics, a man not given to mysticism, taking seriously the idea that mind and matter might not be operating on entirely separate tracks. Their collaboration produced a short book called The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, which remains one of the stranger and more fascinating documents in 20th century intellectual history. Pauli was interested in what quantum physics had revealed about the act of observation, that at the subatomic level, the observer is not separate from what is being observed. The measurement itself participates in producing the outcome. He wondered, cautiously, whether something analogous might be true at the level of lived human experience. Whether attention, sustained, directed, meaningful attention, might function as more than a passive receiver. I want to be honest about the limits of that line of thinking. Quantum effects don't straightforwardly scale up to the level of human consciousness and daily life events. The physics doesn't transfer that cleanly. Pauli himself never made the leap explicit. But the question he and Jung were circling is still a real question. What is the relationship between the quality of a person's attention and the pattern of events they encounter? That question has a psychological answer, even if it doesn't have a supernatural one. And the psychological answer turns out to be genuinely surprising. When you commit to noticing, when you set an intention that certain categories of event are worth attending to, your perceptual system reorganizes around that intention. This is not woo. This is the reticular activating system doing its job. Your brain is constantly filtering an enormous flood of sensory and social information, and the filter is set by what you've decided matters. Tell your brain that recurring numbers matter, and it will surface recurring numbers. Tell it that unexpected connections matter, and it will find unexpected connections in places it previously skipped over. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting. The events it surfaces are real. The connections it finds are real connections. The question is not whether they exist, they do, but whether they would have existed for you without the intention. And the answer, almost certainly, is no. So synchronicity, even stripped of every metaphysical claim, is at minimum a technology for reconfiguring what you are able to perceive. And what you perceive shapes what you do. And what you do shapes what happens next. That's the loop I was stepping into. For 30 days, I was going to run it consciously. The first thing I discovered was that noticing is harder than it sounds. Not because synchronicities are rare, the opposite actually. Once you have committed to registering them, they appear with a frequency that is almost immediately uncomfortable. The discomfort is interesting in itself. It's not excitement exactly. It's something closer to the feeling you get when you realize someone across the room has been watching you for longer than you noticed. A slight vertigo, a sense of scale shifting. I was keeping a journal, a physical notebook, not an app, because I wanted the act of writing to slow things down. And by the end of the first 3 days, I had pages. Before we continue, there's something I want to place in your hands. We've gathered 12 years of Hermetic source material, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Emerald Tablets, and more, stripped of fear bait and rebuilt as a working initiatory sequence into a single 3-volume library for those who feel the pull towards something deeper. Because whether we speak of clearing the field of what was never yours, architecting reality through the 7 Hermetic laws as machinery, or building an auric field with weight that walks into a room ahead of you, one truth remains. Understanding without sequence leaves the ground unowned and nothing moves. This is for anyone who's ready to work the initiation in the order it was always meant to be worked. You'll find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here. I'll give you a moment to do that. Not vague feelings, specific entries. The friend I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, who called the same morning I found a letter she'd written me tucked inside a book I'd pulled randomly from the shelf. The podcast I put on while cooking that spent 20 minutes on a concept I had literally written at the top of my notes an hour earlier, a concept I'd never encountered before that day. The phrase spoken by a stranger on the street that answered almost word for word a question I'd been sitting with for a week. Now, the skeptical reading of all of this is available, and I want to honor it rather than dismiss it. Confirmation bias is real. Once you're hunting for meaningful coincidences, you will find them, because you are, in effect, fishing with a much finer net. The letter might have always been in that book. The podcast might have been covering an idea that was simply in the cultural air. The stranger's phrase might have been close enough that my primed brain rounded it up to an exact match. All of that might be true. But here is the thing I kept returning to throughout that first week. Even if the skeptical explanation is correct, the question of what to do with the moment doesn't change. If I encounter something that feels significant, whether it is cosmically significant or cognitively constructed, the practical question is still, do I follow it or do I walk past it? I had decided for 30 days to follow it. The friend I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, I called her back. That conversation opened something I didn't know was closed. She had been going through a transition that was almost a mirror of one I was navigating, and the hour we spent talking untangled something in my thinking that had been knotted for months. Did the universe arrange that letter to appear that morning? I have no idea. Did treating the coincidence as meaningful produce something real? Yes, demonstrably. That's the frame I settled into by the end of the first week. Not belief, not skepticism, pragmatic engagement. Treat the signal as real and see what it produces. Evaluate the results, not the metaphysics. What I also noticed in that first week was the emotional texture of the experience. There's something that happens to your relationship with time when you are actively looking for correspondence between inner and outer events. The day stops feeling like a sequence of unrelated tasks. It starts feeling more like a text you're reading, something with density and pattern, something that rewards attention. I don't have a clinical name for the shift, but it was palpable, and it affected my mood in ways that were measurable. I was less reactive. I was more curious. Small irritations, the kind that usually metastasize across an afternoon, seemed to matter less, because I was perpetually scanning for the thing underneath the surface of events. I mentioned this to a colleague who has spent years working with contemplative practices, meditation traditions primarily, and she said something that stayed with me. She said the state I was describing sounded less like magical thinking and more like what meditators call beginner's mind. The capacity to meet experience as if it might contain something you haven't seen before. That quality of radical openness. I think she was right, and I think it points at something important about what the synchronicity experiment was actually training. It wasn't training belief in the paranormal. It was training a particular quality of attention, one that most of us spend most of our lives suppressing because it is inefficient and because our culture doesn't have a comfortable framework for it. By the end of week 1, I had filled 37 pages of notebook. I had made 4 decisions I would not otherwise have made, and I was beginning to understand that the experiment was going to be about something considerably larger than I had anticipated. Let me step back from the personal narrative for a moment and go deeper into the mechanics, because I think the mechanics are where the most interesting territory lives. One of the consistent findings across the research on coincidence, and there is genuine academic research on this, not just pop psychology, is that the people who report the highest frequency of meaningful coincidences share certain measurable characteristics. They tend to score high on what researchers call absorption, the capacity to become fully immersed in experience. They tend to be more spiritually or philosophically oriented, not necessarily religious, but oriented toward meaning-making. And they tend to have what psychologists call a high need for cognition, a genuine appetite for thinking through complex problems. That combination is interesting, because it suggests that the people most attuned to synchronicity are not, on average, the least critical thinkers. They are often the most cognitively active. What they're doing differently is not abandoning analysis, it's extending analysis into a domain that more conventional thinkers have preemptively ruled out. Bernard Beitman, a psychiatrist who has probably done more systematic work on coincidence science than anyone alive, makes a distinction I find genuinely clarifying. He separates what he calls the simulator from the observer. The simulator is the mind's predictive machinery, the part that is constantly generating models of what is likely to happen next based on pattern and prior experience. The observer is a different capacity, the ability to step back from the simulator's output and notice what doesn't fit the model. Most of us, most of the time, are running almost entirely on the simulator. We're executing predictions, managing expectations, operating on autopilot. The observer is there. It has to be, because survival requires the ability to detect genuine novelty, but it tends to activate only when something forces it. A shock, a crisis, a deadline. What the synchronicity practice does, and I say this as someone who ran the experiment, not just read about it, is deliberately activate the observer in the absence of crisis. You're training yourself to notice the gaps in the simulation, the moments where what happens doesn't match what you expected. And those gaps, it turns out, are incredibly informationally rich. They're where the new data is. I'm Daniel, and this is Hermetic Talk. And if this is your first time here, what we do on this channel is take ideas like this seriously enough to actually think them through. Not to sell you a belief system, to do the intellectual work. Now, back to the architecture. There's a concept in complex systems theory called emergence, the phenomenon where patterns appear at a higher level of organization that could not have been predicted from examining the components at a lower level. The classic example is consciousness emerging from neurons, or traffic patterns emerging from individual drivers. No single driver decides to create a traffic wave, but traffic waves appear with perfect regularity whenever density crosses a certain threshold. I think meaningful coincidence has an emergent quality to it. When you are operating with a certain density of attention, when you are tracking multiple streams of experience simultaneously, patterns become visible that are genuinely invisible at lower levels of attentiveness. This doesn't require the patterns to have been placed there by an external intelligence. It only requires that reality is complex enough that there are always more patterns present than any given level of attention can detect. And here is the part I find most compelling, and I'll be direct about this. I personally think this is the most underrated insight in the entire conversation about synchronicity. The patterns you find change what you do next, which changes the patterns available to be found. The process is recursive. Attention shapes action. Action shapes the environment. The environment shapes what attention can find. You are not a passive receiver of a pre-existing signal. You are a participant in generating the conditions under which certain signals become possible. This is what makes the 30-day experiment so much more than a curiosity. If this recursive loop is real, and I believe the evidence, both personal and empirical, suggests it is, then the practice of following synchronicities is not really about reading messages from the cosmos. It's about learning to participate consciously in a feedback loop that most people are running unconsciously. It's about taking the wheel of a process that is happening anyway. The question that opened up for me in week 2, as I was sitting with all of this, was, if that's true, what does it imply about the way we make decisions? About the way we navigate uncertainty? About what we're actually doing when we say we're following our intuition? That's where the experiment started to get strange. And I mean strange in the most precise sense of the word. Not frightening, not supernatural, but genuinely outside the frame I had brought into it. Because here's what I hadn't anticipated going into week 3. I had assumed this experiment would be primarily about noticing things, about perception. What I didn't see coming was that it would fundamentally reorganize the way I made decisions. Not by giving me better information, but by changing what counted as information in the first place. Most of us make decisions using what I'd call a closed architecture. We gather data from the sources we've pre-approved as legitimate: reason, evidence, expert opinion, past experience, and we filter out everything else as noise. That's not stupidity, that's efficiency. The brain is a prediction machine, and it runs on compressed models of reality. You can't function if you treat every sensation, every random encounter, every weird dream as equally valid input. So you build filters. And those filters work until they start cutting out signals you actually need. What the synchronicity experiment did at the structural level was widen the aperture of what I was willing to treat as potentially meaningful. And the first thing that happened when I did that, the thing I genuinely didn't expect, was that my decision-making slowed down. Not because I was more confused, because I was more honest about how much uncertainty I was operating in. There's a concept I kept returning to during this period, one that comes from the intersection of cognitive science and systems theory. The idea that every decision is really a bet on which model of reality is most accurate. When you make a choice, you're not just choosing an action, you're endorsing a particular map of how the world works. And the question that synchronicity keeps pressing on you is, how confident are you actually that your map is right? I'm Daniel, and this is Hermetic Talk, and I want to be precise about what I'm claiming here, because it would be easy to misread this as an argument for magical thinking or for abandoning rational judgment. It's not. What I'm saying is something more specific, that the rational mind, operating alone, tends to systematically underweight certain categories of information, particularly information that arrives through pattern recognition, emotional resonance, and what we loosely call intuition. Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why we have Insights Academy, a free newsletter where I go deeper into hidden knowledge, ancient wisdom, metaphysics, and the nature of consciousness, the knowledge we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive the Kabbalion as a welcome gift. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. And that synchronicity, whether or not it has any metaphysical reality, functions as a forcing mechanism that reintroduces that information into the decision loop. In week 3 of the experiment, I was sitting with a significant professional decision, one I'd been circling for months without resolving. I won't go into the details here, but it was the kind of choice where both options were defensible on paper, and logic alone wasn't cutting through. I had built elaborate pro and con frameworks. I had talked to people whose judgment I trusted. I was still stuck. And then, across a period of about 4 days, I started noticing a cluster of synchronicities all pointing in the same direction. A conversation with a stranger that touched, obliquely, on exactly the tension I was sitting with. A line in a book I'd picked up for completely unrelated reasons that landed with almost uncomfortable precision. A memory that surfaced, unbidden, of a moment years earlier when I had faced an analogous choice and made the wrong call by ignoring a very clear gut signal. Now here's what I want to be careful about. I am not saying the universe was sending me a memo. I am saying that my attention was finally landing on information that had been available all along, but that my closed decision architecture had been filtering out. The synchronicities weren't new data. They were permission to use data I'd already collected, but hadn't let myself wait. I made the decision. And I want to be honest that it's too early to call it definitively right or wrong by any external measure. But what I can say is that it felt structurally different from most decisions I make. Less like a conclusion I reasoned toward, and more like a recognition of something I already knew. Less like solving a problem, and more like removing the obstacle I'd placed between myself and an answer I'd been afraid to act on. The philosopher William James had a phrase for this: the will to believe. The idea that at the edges of evidence, where logic runs out, the act of committing to a belief is itself a creative act, one that shapes the reality it responds to. Jung would have called it the compensatory function of the unconscious, surfacing through synchronicity the information the ego has been refusing to integrate. The framing is different. The mechanism they're describing is startlingly similar, and the more I sat with this in week 3, the more I started to see the experiment not as a test of whether synchronicities are real, but as a test of what happens when you take your own inner signals seriously enough to act on them. By week 4, something had shifted that I didn't have clean language for at the time. The synchronicities hadn't stopped. If anything, they had intensified, or rather, my ability to register them had sharpened to the point where the experience of daily life had taken on a kind of texture it didn't used to have. Everything felt more signal-dense, more legible, like I had been living in a city my whole life and only just learned to read the street signs. But what emerged in week 4 wasn't just more synchronicities. It was something underneath them, a pattern behind the pattern. And this is where the experiment crossed into territory that I genuinely struggled to articulate, even privately. Here's the best way I can put it. Over the course of the 30 days, the synchronicities I was tracking began to cluster. They weren't random. They weren't evenly distributed across topics and domains. They were organizing themselves, or I was organizing them. I honestly can't fully separate those two things, around a small number of core themes. And those themes, without exception, were the things I most needed to look at and had been most successfully avoiding. This is one of the places where Jung's framework becomes genuinely useful rather than just poetically appealing. He argued that the unconscious is not merely a storage room for repressed content. It is an active, generative process that is constantly trying to bring the psyche into balance. When we overinvest in the conscious, rational, ego-directed side of our functioning, the unconscious compensates. It sends signals. It generates dreams, symptoms, emotional reactions that seem disproportionate, and, Jung believed, meaningful coincidences that act as external mirrors of internal states. What I was experiencing in week 4 felt exactly like that. The synchronicities were clustering around my blind spots, around the questions I had framed as already settled, around the relationships and commitments I had been treating as fixed when they were actually in motion. They were functioning less like cosmic mail and more like a very well-calibrated diagnostic, surfacing the system errors I had learned to work around rather than resolve. I want to share something that happened in that final week that I've told almost no one, because it's the kind of thing that sounds either profound or embarrassing depending on your priors, and I haven't fully decided which it is. I personally think it's the most important thing that came out of the entire 30 days, but I'm aware that's a strong claim. I had been keeping a journal throughout the experiment, tracking each synchronicity, noting the context, recording my interpretation in the moment. Somewhere in the middle of week 4, I went back and read the whole thing from the beginning, and what I saw stopped me. The individual entries, taken one at a time, read as a series of interesting but disconnected observations. A recurring symbol here, a meaningful conversation there, an uncanny timing somewhere else. But read in sequence, over the full arc of the 30 days, they told a story, a coherent story, with a beginning, a middle, and what felt unmistakably like a trajectory toward a conclusion. Not a conclusion I had planned, not a narrative I had consciously constructed, a story that had apparently assembled itself through the accumulation of moments I had noticed, but not yet connected. Now, I want to be rigorous here, because this is exactly the point at which it's most tempting to let the experience outrun the analysis. There are at least 2 explanations for what I was seeing. The first is that the universe, or the unconscious, or the field, or whatever you want to call the organizing intelligence at work in these things, had been communicating a coherent message across 30 days, and I had been receiving it piece by piece. The second is that the human mind is an extraordinary story-making machine, and that given enough data points and enough motivation, it will find a narrative anywhere, including in randomness. Both of those explanations are worth taking seriously, and here's what I find genuinely interesting. They lead to almost identical practical implications. If the first is true, then following synchronicities is a way of receiving guidance. If the second is true, then following synchronicities is a way of excavating what your own unconscious is already trying to tell you. In either case, the act of paying attention, of treating your experience as meaningful, produces outcomes that treating it as meaningless does not. That asymmetry matters. It's not a proof of anything metaphysical, but it is, I think, a serious argument for the practice, regardless of the ultimate nature of what's happening beneath it. The story I saw in my journal over those 30 days pointed, consistently and unmistakably, toward one thing. A threshold I had been standing at for longer than I wanted to admit. And the question that the experiment left me with, the one I carried out of the 30 days and into whatever came next, was not whether the synchronicities were real. It was whether I was going to act on what they had shown me. There's a question I've been asked more than any other since I started talking about this experiment publicly, and it comes in different forms, but it's always the same question underneath. Did it work? Did following the synchronicities for 30 days actually change anything, or did it just change how you felt about things that were changing anyway? It's a fair question, and I want to answer it as honestly as I can, which means I have to resist the temptation to give it a cleaner shape than it actually has. Here's what I can say with confidence. The 30 days changed my relationship to uncertainty. Not by reducing it, there's as much I don't know now as there was before I started, but by changing my posture toward it. Before the experiment, uncertainty was primarily a problem to be solved, a gap in information that I needed to close before I could move forward. After the experiment, it started to function more like a medium, something to navigate within, rather than something to eliminate before navigation could begin. That sounds abstract, so let me make it concrete. In the months following the 30 days, I found myself making decisions faster, not because I had more information, but because I had recalibrated which sources of information I was willing to trust. I was weighting intuition more heavily. I was paying attention to the way my body responded to options, not just my mind. I was noticing when a choice felt alive versus when it felt like a conclusion I was reasoning myself into because it looked correct on a spreadsheet. I won't pretend that every decision made through this lens turned out well. Some didn't. But I also noticed something interesting about the ones that didn't. They failed instructively. They produced feedback that was legible. Whereas the decisions I'd made purely by logic, when they failed, tended to fail in ways that felt arbitrary, as if reality had simply refused to cooperate with a perfectly reasonable plan. There's a deeper change that's harder to quantify. The 30 days left me with a different sense of my own agency. Not more agency in the conventional sense, not more control over outcomes, but something like a more accurate understanding of what agency actually consists of, which is, I think, mostly the quality of attention you bring to a situation, and the degree to which you're willing to act on what that attention reveals, even when it contradicts the plan. Hermann Hesse wrote somewhere that the call of life is not to find security, but to encounter the world with readiness. I've been sitting with that sentence since long before this experiment began, but it landed differently after. Because readiness, I came to understand, is not a state you achieve once and maintain. It's a practice, a continuous act of presence. And synchronicity, whatever its ultimate nature, is one of the most effective practices I've encountered for staying in it. I want to talk about what happened on day 30 specifically, because it crystallized something I hadn't been able to see clearly until that point. I spent the last day of the experiment doing nothing special, deliberately, intentionally ordinary. I went for a long walk. I sat in a coffee shop for a couple of hours. I didn't seek out synchronicities. I didn't scan for patterns or try to decode what I was encountering. I just moved through the day with the quality of attention I had been practicing for a month, without the agenda. And what I noticed, and this is the thing that actually surprised me, was that the world felt full. Not full of messages I needed to interpret, just full, present, three-dimensional in a way it doesn't always feel when I'm running on autopilot. Like the difference between watching a film and being inside one. That quality of presence, that's the thing I'd most want to hand to someone who asked me what the experiment produced. Not a method for receiving cosmic guidance, not a framework for predicting the future, but a kind of aliveness to the texture of experience that most of us have in childhood and then gradually, almost imperceptibly, lose as we become efficient adults with systems and filters and very good reasons to stop paying attention to what doesn't fit the model. Synchronicity, practiced seriously, is a technology for recovering that aliveness. That's a bolder claim than I expected to make at the start of 30 days. But after living it, and I have to be honest, I don't know how to make a smaller one. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead argued that the universe is not a collection of objects, but a community of experiences. That reality, at its most fundamental level, is composed not of things, but of events, and that each event is a moment of experience, of response, of participation. If he's right, and the more I sit with it, the more structurally compelling I find it, then synchronicity isn't a glitch in a mechanical universe. It's evidence of the universe's basic nature, breaking through the crust of our habitual inattention. So let me bring this to the place the experiment actually brought me, and try to do it justice without tying it into a bow that makes it seem neater than it is. 30 days of following synchronicities didn't give me answers. What it gave me was a much cleaner view of the questions I had been refusing to ask. And that, I've come to think, is actually the deeper function of this whole territory. Not revelation, but clarification. Not a voice from the beyond telling you what to do, but a mirror, gradually clearing, reflecting back the shape of what you already know and haven't been willing to see. I came into this experiment skeptical, as I said at the start. Not hostile. I've spent too much time with Jung, with the Hermetic tradition, with the mystical literature across cultures to be casually dismissive, but genuinely uncertain whether this was something that produced real outcomes or something that produced the feeling of real outcomes, which are not the same thing, and the difference matters. After 30 days, my skepticism hasn't disappeared, but it's changed its shape. I'm no longer skeptical about whether following synchronicities does something. I watched it do things, repeatedly, in real time, in my own life. What I'm still sitting with, and I think this is the honest position, is precisely what it's doing, and by what mechanism, and whether the metaphysical frameworks we reach for to explain it are actually describing the phenomenon or just giving us a language that feels adequate to its scale. Here's the thing about thresholds, though, and this is where I want to leave you, because I think it's the most important thing the experiment surfaced. A threshold is only a threshold if you cross it. Insight without action is just decoration. And one of the consistent things that the synchronicity literature across traditions, the Hermetic, the Jungian, the contemplative, agrees on is that the meaning of a synchronicity is always ultimately practical. It is always pointing towards something you are being called to do, or to release, or to become. It never just points at itself. The question the 30 days left me with, the one I walked out of the experiment carrying and haven't fully put down since, is about what it means to live as if meaning is real. Not as a philosophical proposition, not as a comforting metaphor, but as an operational assumption that shapes how you move through actual days, make actual choices, maintain actual relationships. Because the alternative isn't neutral. The assumption that experience is fundamentally meaningless, that synchronicities are just apophenia, that intuition is just pattern matching on insufficient data, that the thread of significance you feel running through your life is just a story your brain tells to make the randomness bearable. That assumption has consequences too. It produces a particular kind of life. A life that may be very reasonable and very defended and very comprehensible from the outside, and that can still feel from the inside like you are missing something you cannot name. I've received a lot of responses since I started exploring these ideas on this channel. One that stayed with me came from a viewer who wrote, "I used to think all of this was wishful thinking. Then I started actually paying attention, and I realized the wishful thinking was in the other direction. I had been wishing so hard that nothing meant anything, because meaning would have required me to change." That landed, because I think it's true for a lot of people, and I think it was true for me in ways I'm still mapping. The Hermetic tradition, from which so much of this conversation draws its conceptual vocabulary, opens with a deceptively simple proposition. As above, so below. As within, so without. The structure of the cosmos is reflected in the structure of the self, and the self is a microcosm of the cosmos. What happens inside you is not separate from what happens around you. It is continuous with it. Synchronicity is, in the Hermetic reading, not an exception to the way the universe works. It is the way the universe works, briefly made visible through a crack in our ordinary attention. 30 days of following that crack, wherever it led, brought me to a place I didn't expect to reach when I started. Not certainty, but commitment. Not proof, but practice. Not an answer to whether synchronicities are real, but a lived sense that treating them as real produces a life that is more awake, more responsive, more genuinely navigated, and that this, in the end, may be all the proof that was ever on offer. The experiment is over. The practice isn't. And if any part of what I've laid out here has touched something in you, some question that's been circling without quite landing, then I'd invite you to try it yourself. Not to believe anything before you start, just to pay attention, seriously and consistently, for long enough to see what attention, seriously applied, actually does. That's always been the invitation at the center of this tradition. Not faith as a substitute for experience. Faith as the willingness to have the experience.